Hi everyone, in today's video I'm going to be going through how I do white cat fur. This video is a little bit longer than normal, but I wanted to try and fit in as much information as I possibly could. Again, this is a video hopefully aimed at all levels, so the colour palette is as limited as I possibly could make it. Here I'm just using, I think it's sepia 10%, and I'm just going over kind of the little cheeks of the cat's face. And I'm just doing this to kind of create a rough shadow. So at the beginning stages, like when doing the eye, it's just about kind of getting the rough shapes down and creating the illusion of the anatomy of the cat. And this is part 3 of this How to Draw a Cat course, so if you haven't seen the other videos, please do so. And the last part will be next week, and that will be black fur, ears and whiskers, so there's a lot in that one. But I hope you like it so far anyway, and I hope you found it useful. So I'm just going over every area again that I did with the sepia 10% with the steel grey. And as you can see, I'm kind of mapping out where the little lines where the whiskers go as well. Okay, so with white fur, all I do for the highlights is leave that space clear, so I don't add any fur where I want the highlights to be. I'm using a little bit of anthracenoid pink as well towards the mouth, just to give it a little bit more of a pinky soft tone. Because as you get closer to the muzzle and the nose, the fur comes a little bit thinner and you can kind of see more of the skin. So to get that skin effect kind of coming through, I just use a little bit of anthracenoid pink. I think I also used violet pink and dark flesh 50% to kind of fill in the little muzzle mouth area. And as you can see, I'm just keeping my pressure really light. I'm not pressing down. The more you press down, the harder it is to kind of get that soft blend in when you wet it, so I try and keep my layers really nice and light at this stage. And it's not too important which direction you want to draw in, but I tend to try and draw in the direction of the cat's fur, just to help get into the swing of that. And as you can see, I'm just going over all of the areas that we've just done with a damp brush, and I just wet the brush a little bit and then take any excess of water off with my hand. So it's not too wet, it's just a little bit damp, and that kind of blends the colours together without spreading them too much. And you can see I'm kind of doing it in a circular motion, and that's just to blend the colours together. I find if I kind of do it in like strokes, then it can look a little bit streaky, so I kind of like to do tiny little circular motions, and that blends it together pretty nice and smooth. So I try to keep the beginning layers that I know I'm going to make wet really kind of vague, if that makes sense. So there's not much detail there, it's literally just colour and shadow, trying to create the shape and trying to get a rough base of colours down. Just because when you wet the layers, they really do blend together, and if you're trying to create fur, it'll just blend and you'll lose all of the detail that you've spent time creating. I've done it before, and it's not very fun to kind of see all that detail you've done wash away. So I tend to keep all of the beginning layers nice and light and just very rough, and then do all the detail on top of the wet layers, but make sure they're nice and dry before I did any pencil. So as you can see, I'm kind of working on the bridge of the nose now. I'm waiting for that left side of the face to dry, so while I wait for the left side of the face to dry, I'm just doing the bridge of the nose. So I put down a little bit of dark flesh, and I think I used anthracenoid pink as well, and then blended that together. So the bridge of the nose is similar to the mouth, whereas you can kind of see a lot of pink skin there. The fur is very small and thin, so you can see a lot of the nose coming through. So that's why there's kind of a lot of pink concentrated on the bridge of the nose. And what you might find as well when you come to do any kind of fur on top, like next to the features of the face, that your features now don't stand out quite as much as you thought they did next to the blank piece of paper. So once you've kind of got your fur in, if you want to go over any of the features afterwards and darken them up or make them stand out or change the colours even, you can do so. It is sometimes a lot easier to see the colours and shadows once the fur is in, so sometimes I like to go over the eyes and the nose and just darken up little areas around there. And again, using the same colours, the sepia 10% and then the steel grey, and then using a bit of violet pink around the muzzle. And then blending with the damp brush. So I do like to make sure all of the layers are wet, as you've seen. All layers are dry, once they've been wet, because I find once I add pencil kind of on top of that, it can become a little bit chalky looking and not super smooth. So I try and make sure all of those are nice and dry before I add any more pencil. That's just a personal preference. I know some people do it differently, but this is just how I like to do these. And here I'm just adding a little bit of steel grey, paying really close attention now to my reference photo. I could see that there's a little bit of shadow and a little bit of fur kind of curling around this little nose area and changing it out. So I use a mix of the steel grey and the sepia 10%. These two colours are definitely my go-to for this white cat fur. And then the nose kind of has like a little bit of like an eyeliner effect. If you've ever done eyeliner before on your own eyes, you'll see that it kind of flicks up from the bottom lash line. So similar with this nose, the lines kind of flick up from the nostril and outwards, ever so slightly at an angle. But yeah, that's kind of how the nose is shaped a little bit. So that's kind of how I look at them and do those shadows around the nose. And then again, I'm just darkening up around the nose area. And I like to use tracing paper as well, because I find it protects the paper, not from the pencils so much with these, but mostly from my hand. I try to keep my hand off the paper as much as possible. These pencils are quite good and they don't really smudge as much as other pencils that I found. I think it's because they're water soluble, so when they blend, they don't move around too much. And even the dry layers on top, they're pretty sturdy and they really don't smudge too much. That being said, they do still smudge a little bit, so I try and use this tracing paper and I tape it down so it doesn't move around. That is also another reason why I like to do the white fur before I did the black fur, because I found that the tracing paper would kind of be dragging any black pigment across to the white side of the cat, so I thought it's better that any light colours go into the dark area rather than the other way around. And here you can see I've just done a little bit more tone with the sepia 10%, and now I'm building up the detail itself. So just small little strokes with the pencil. I'm paying close attention to my reference photo. You'll see with noses, especially dog noses, that fur kind of curls into itself the closer you get to that little line underneath the nose that connects both cheeks, if that makes sense. And then it kind of goes back out towards the outside of the cat again. So yeah, I just recommend that you pay close attention to your reference photo, and if you have any animals at home, try and look at them as well and study their faces, see where their fur falls, and you'll kind of start to notice patterns in your subjects. And here you can see I'm just adding the detail in. I think I'm using the burnt sienna for this. And here you can kind of see that I'm just curling in the fur towards the nose and then bringing it out with the sepia 10%. And here I'm using the slate grey and a little bit of a mix with the sepia 50% as well. I find that the slate grey is a darker version of the steel grey, and the sepia 50% is obviously a darker version of the sepia 10%. So those make really good pencils when you want to darken any areas that you've already done. And here you can really see how light my pressure is because it's barely showing up on the screen, but there is pigment going down there, and I'm just adding the very long strokes of this cat's fur. So basically when you're doing long fur you want to keep your strokes really nice and long, and short fur is really nice and short. I find that fur is just lots of little scribbles in different directions, so it's kind of important to pay attention to the direction and the length and then just scribble. And that's how I do my fur. And kind of the more scribbles you do and the more layers of these that you do, the more kind of depth that you get, and it really creates the illusion of layers. Try and change the colours that you use. So I'm using the sepia 10% and the steel grey kind of intermittently and switching those out, and I find that also creates the depth, and layering them together works really nicely for that. And here you can kind of see I'm being a little bit more precise with the sepia 10%. I'm using this colour mostly for the shadows, and I'm keeping the strokes a little bit longer because they're a little bit shorter, because sometimes there are breaks in the fur, and that is kind of what I'm doing with this colour. I'm just creating a little bit of breaks in the fur where it's not super long, but there's kind of shadows in between the clumps. And then again with the steel grey. So I find that when even though it's the same colours, I'm using the same two colours that I'm using, the more I layer them, the more depth I get, and it really changes a tone of the colour then. So yeah, that's kind of why I'm using only the same colours, but it looks quite different every time. And for the little cheek areas on the muzzle, I'm kind of following the whisker line now. So you can see how I've kind of created that illusion already, because I left some of the space negative and then I'm shading those long lines. So this is kind of where the whiskers come out from, and they have these weird little lines. On some cats it looks like dots, but on longer fur cats like Willow here, it's just kind of one big long line. So I'm just filling those in again with the steel grey and then the sepia 10% over the top, and occasionally adding some rough strokes that kind of just come out of the line to give it a bit more illusion of fur, because these aren't perfect lines, as you can see. They're very kind of jaggedy, very scribbly, and that is just the cat's fur. And again, paying really close attention to my reference photo as I create these lines. And then on the bottom, kind of just fill in the pencil in again. The lines are a lot darker on this area, obviously because the muzzle is kind of rounded, so I'm just adding a little bit of shadow underneath the muzzle there. So what you might also be able to see is, because we did kind of a violet pink and a grenade pink base layer, that the pinky colours are really showing through, even though we've added lots of other colours on top of those. And here I'm using the sepia 50% just to darken up those areas that I can no longer darken with just the sepia 10%. So yeah, I'm just kind of bringing those lines back in and creating a little bit more depth around the bottom of the cat's muzzle near the mouth. And with the shadows, I try and use these really sparingly because it's a lot easier to darken the white than it is to lighten the white. So I'd rather make the white too dark than too light at this stage. Or too light than too dark, sorry. Because yeah, it's obviously a lot easier to add darker colours than it is to take them away. So yeah, I'll just use this colour very sparingly and then take a step back, look at the cat, and if I'm happy with it, then I'll leave it, and if not, then I'll go back in. But I try and do it in really small sections, just to make sure that I don't overdo it. I find that white is a colour that's either super white pale or just muddy dark brown. It just goes, it's kind of one extreme to the other and so quickly, so I try and be as careful as I possibly can. And then I'm just blending in the little darker areas that I've created with the sepia 10%, again keeping kind of really rough strands of fur poking out of these shadows. And you can't really see on this, but I'm doing it from the top to the bottom, so I'm just blending the top of the fluff, the dark areas, to the bottom. So yeah, I find when you work from the top to the bottom of the dark areas, so I'm starting from the lines themselves and then blending out towards the other line, but not going all the way. It kind of creates the illusion of the little cheeks. And then just kind of lots of layering of different colours. So you're going back in with a steel grey, and I find the steel grey is a really nice cool toned grey, so I just use that when I think things are too warm. And then here I'm just kind of blending out this white bit a little bit more, so I'm trying to get this area ready for when we do the black layers. And then again blending out with a steel grey, pushing this white into some of the black areas again. So what I mean by that is I'm not creating a very harsh line, it's really very loose, and I'm just going to kind of draw over the white with a black pencil, and it's going to be kind of very random how I do it. I don't want a really very harsh line, so I'm just doing that kind of, really soft and random, if that makes sense. And then just kind of creating those little clumps of fluff again with the slate grey. So I find one problem that I know I used to do when I started drawing kind of coloured animals was I would create kind of a harsh line, so this is where the white area is and this is where the dark area is, and then when they kind of met together it was very harsh. There was no kind of blending of the two, it was just this is this and this is that side. So I find that when I'm kind of doing my white and black animals now, or any coloured animal, I try and blend one colour into the other one before adding the other colour. So say white into black, for example, I push the white colours into the black area, and then when I come to add the black, I kind of push the black over the white ever so slightly. So there's no harsh line between the two, they kind of overlap each other in a very soft way. But yeah, it really creates the illusion of these colours merging. And because her fur is very long, the colours will merge and overlap and interlock with each other, so I try and keep those areas really nice and soft. But I will go into that in a little bit more detail next week as we add the white fur in. And as you can see, I'm just using my sandpaper then to sharpen my pencils. I find that doing that kind of increases the life of the pencil rather than continuously sharpening it, which shortens the life of the pencil. And then I'm using the white pencil, now it's nice and sharp, just to go over all of the shadows that we created and adding nice little highlights. This white pencil, they're all museum aquarelle pencils by Caran D'Ache, and this white one is perfect for adding highlights. It just layers over every colour so well, even the black, as you'll see next week, it just layers over it beautifully. And then going in with a slate grey and just kind of darkening up any areas I think need to be darkened. And then again, I'm just kind of pushing some white fur over the lines that we created before, and that will soften them out ever so slightly. So hopefully you could see then I was clearly going over certain areas that we've already done, and that just kind of softens them but also creates again the illusion of layers, which is the illusion of fur. So kind of the more that you layer the pencils, the more that you'll get this kind of depth. And then again just going over any other areas with the steel grey, and just softening those up again. And again, really light pressure so it doesn't leave any harsh marks. If you find that you're pressing on too hard or you have a very hard hand, I'm not sure what the word is called, sorry, try and hold the end of the pencil. So don't hold too close to the tip, instead hold the end, and that will kind of force your hand to be a little bit softer. And here we're just doing the chin, and the chin is a lot darker than all the areas we've done before. Again, I am building this up as slowly as I possibly can because I don't want to make it muddy, and I don't want to have to try and lighten it up if I go too dark. So I'm just using a nice mix of dark flesh, sepia, and I think burnt ochre, and I also used a little bit of chestnut, I do believe. And I'm using French grey in the pencil extender, so that's a Derwent pencil extender, and here using anthraquinone pink. So yeah, just really kind of varying up the colours that I use and kind of outlining the mouth there with the sepia 50%. So it's not too important which colours you use when and where, but I would recommend kind of sticking to the grey colours. So if you have a nice warm grey, use that, and a nice cool grey. If you can get a mix of the two, that would be really good. Also the pinks, and yeah, kind of like a burnt ochre terracotta, if you have those as well, something like that would work beautifully on a white cat. And again, blending it with the water, so this is a damp brush, and just blending those together. So you can see if there was any detail, it just completely be blended by now. And then while we wait for the chin to dry, I'm just going back over to the bridge of the nose. So I really like the bridge of the nose. There's kind of lots of different fur directions that go in here. This kind of, if you look right down the middle, there's like a diamond shape where the fur meets together. So towards kind of the end of the nose, the fur points downwards and inwards. Towards the top of the nose, it points inwards but upwards. And then away from the eye, it kind of curls all the way around, if that makes sense, like a crescent shape. It goes up and then sideways, inwards, outwards, down. It goes all the way around. So it's really important to pay attention to your reference photo and kind of, yeah, make note of all the different directions of the fur. So you can see I'm just really roughly marking those in, paying a little bit of attention to where the fur goes, like the direction of the fur, but again, not too much because it will all blend together anyway. And then here I used the Light Flesh 10%. I found this was a really nice kind of golden, creamy colour, but it wasn't too overpowering for this area. And again, taking some anthraquinone pink to the bottom of the nose, just to make that a little bit more fleshy. And then my favourite one again, sepia 10%, just to darken up all of the steel grey around the areas that we've just done. The sepia 10% as well is a really good colour for any areas that are very pink, so like the bottom of the nose, because it's a warm grey. It will shadow those areas really nicely, whereas a cool grey might kind of turn them a bit more purpley rather than keeping the nice pink colour. And then blending those colours together. So you might not be able to see it too much if you focus on just the nose area, but if you look at the kind of the top of the fur compared to where the eyes are, for example, just above the eyes to the left and to the right of it, you can see how already that colour does look very different to the rest of the white paper. Even though it's such a small change, there is still a change there. And then just blending that together again with the steel grey, and you can see already this chin area is going really nice and dark now. So I find that it usually only takes 1 or 2 wet layers before I like to add detail, especially on this paper. It takes the layers really nice and well. On other papers this may vary. So on this cat I used the rowney, the Langton, and on other works I use rowney Aquafine. I find that the Aquafine usually takes a few more layers before I'm completely satisfied with the colour, but this one only takes a few layers. And then once that bit's dry, just going over with the sepia 10% to create the illusion of the fur now. So I find that the chin, because it was so fluffy, she kind of had a line of shadow that was just under the chin that you could kind of see coming through the fur. I'm not sure if that makes any sense. But she had, this really hard, it was quite a harsh line. So to blend it out, I just pushed all of the pencil up with the direction of the fur. The line still was quite harsh though, so it was important that I added that in there. And then I think I used the raw umber, the sepia 50% here, just to darken up the mouth area. So you can see how that's starting to take shape a little bit more now. So the chin is a lot darker than the cheek areas should be for obvious reasons. It's kind of pushed back out of the light. So that's kind of why we're using a lot more darker colours for this area. And again, just paying attention to that kind of harsh chin line. It's much more noticeable on cats with short hair, obviously, but because she has such a fluffy chin, it was kind of covered by the fur, but it was still there. So hopefully you can see what I mean. So there's kind of a harsh line, and then as you got towards the end of the chin, it went really nice and light again. That's literally just because it's end of the fur that's not actually connected to her chin. So the area that is connected to her actual chin is the really dark parts, and then any lighter bits on the end of that is extra fur. So I hope that makes sense. You can kind of see where the end of her actual chin starts and then the end of the fur. And then just using a bit of the French grey again to just darken up some of those areas. And this is kind of the detail layer, so this is where I am adding all of the strokes of fur. So you can see I'm just kind of drawing little lines pointing down from the middle of the mouth and outwards. So you can see as well how they're not just in one direction, they're not straight down. There are different angles depending on which part of the chin I am drawing. And then again, just darkening up the mouth. I think it took quite a while before I was happy with how dark the mouth was. But again, that's just because I don't want to make it too dark, and then I don't like how dark it is, so I try and build that up slowly. And then using my lovely sandpaper again, just to sharpen this white pencil. Getting ready for those white highlights. And then just kind of darkening up or adding a little bit more colour, to the bottom of the chin. I found it was a little bit more of a cooler shade, so I tried to add that steel grey in the end. And now I'm going over the chin with the white pencil, and you can see the direction of the fur here a little bit better. And just keeping areas closer to the mouth really nice and short, and as I got further away from the mouth the fur got longer, so I make my pencil strokes a lot longer. I find that as well as creating really nice highlights, the white pencil is also really nice for blending the colours together. If you use a really light pressure, or if you get the super colour instead of the museum, the super colour is brilliant for burnishing layers and blending them together. The white museum is a little bit more opaque, so it's a little bit more coverage, but the super colour is a lot nicer and less opaque, so it's a perfect blending colour. And I'm just using little colours of chestnut and brown to just kind of warm up any areas, especially closer to the mouth. I find that they're a really nice colour to kind of create a darker pink. So yeah, I use lots of nice browns and chestnuts to create dark highlights around the muzzle area. And then using the French grey again to just darken up that little line near the chin. So it creates a really nice, kind of darker colour there. And then just using the steel grey again, just to go over the areas we created before around the bridge of the nose. This is basically kind of a rinse and repeat what we did before, which is kind of the technique for most watercolour pencils, I assume. But yeah, you kind of have to go over some areas again to create the layers and the depth that you want, because you might not always get the tone straight away just from the first layer. In fact, you won't. Yeah, you have to kind of layer them, and it is a slow process. So here we're just layering the second layer. I think this is going to be a dry layer of steel grey. So just kind of blending the top of the fur, so that's where it's going to blend into the black, and then creating the highlights on the inner corner on the left side of the face. And then just repeat the process over on the right side. There you go again, I'm just kind of mapping out where I want the shadows to go, and then just drawing in the little highlights. And you can see I'm kind of following the direction of where the fur should go. So I'm pointing it upwards and then taking it in towards the corner of the eye and then down to the nose. And here you can kind of see I'm creating that little diamond shape where the fur meets in the middle of the nose. And then just softly blending around the top of it. So here you go again, you can see that I'm just kind of adding more details in. So here I'm creating the fur. So around the nose I used the burnt sienna, and this was just to kind of create a little bit of illusion of fur. So as you get closer to the nose, the fur gets a lot more sparse, a lot thinner. So I used this nice pinky colour just to kind of create little gaps where the fur isn't, and where you can kind of see the skin coming through a little bit. So I noticed on the left side of the nose as well, there was kind of a little pinky swirl, and on the right side as well, actually, sorry, there was kind of little swirls where the fur kind of, it kind of swirled around into the nose, if that makes sense. So from one side it swirled into the middle. If you look at the reference photo, you might be able to see what I'm talking about a little bit more. But yeah, I tried to pay close attention to that area, and again creating really, really tiny little strokes to create the illusion of the fur. And then using the dark flesh 50% to just darken up the outer corners of the nose there. And then again creating more of the little swirly parts of the fur and bringing those up ever so slightly. So these strokes are really, really small. This is basically the gaps where the fur isn't. So when you're kind of drawing white fur, you're kind of doing everything else that isn't the white fur when you can kind of see these gaps. So just doing tiny, tiny little lines, and there you go. You can kind of see already that that nose is coming through a little bit more. And then again, like I said before, I like this CP 10% because it's a nice cool tone colour, and it really is a great shadow for pinky areas. So that's all I'm doing with the CP 10%, is I'm using it to blend those pink colours into the white a little bit more. So just going all over those areas again just to darken them, and yet it's blending that really nicely into the white fur. And then you can kind of see there's a little bit of kind of, I'm not sure where you can see the nose is going up and the bridge of the nose, so I'm just adding that in as well. So I'm just paying really close attention to my reference photo. You can kind of see where parts of the anatomy stand out a little bit more, and that's all that the fur and the shadows do, is just show where the anatomy is, and that's creating the illusion of this cat's face. So fur on any animal depends on the bone structure of the subject. So anytime that the bone structure changes, the shape of the fur or even the direction of the fur might change as well. So you can kind of see this on the nose. As the nose kind of curves down a little bit more, the fur direction changes. And as the nose comes up again, the fur direction changes. So in between the top of the head, the eyes and the nose, there's 3 different directions of fur there. So it's really important to pay attention to those. Here, as you can see, like they're kind of pointing inwards towards the eye, and then downwards again outside the nose. So that bit it's a really tricky area to get right, so pay really close attention to the reference photo. And again, you can see me adding tiny little bits of fur around that diamond shape. So you can see already, even though we've done only a few layers of pencil, that fur direction and the tone of the whole piece is coming together a lot more. We definitely get an illusion of fur here. And again, just adding a little bit more pink on areas that I want to stand out a little bit more. And I'm sorry for when the camera shakes. I promise I'm not pressing on too hard, but the table isn't super sturdy, so it does shake occasionally. But yeah, I'm just trying to use soft strokes, especially towards the longer fur, and you can kind of see how I go from holding the closer to the end of the pencil to the tip of the pencil, depending on the length of the fur. And again, taking a really nice, I think this is cinnamon, and just kind of highlighting, shading towards the end of the nose. And again, just using the sepia 50% to kind of blend those colours nicely together. You can kind of see the fur texture starting to come out now on the nose a little bit, and that's again why it's so important to kind of do these layers. And like I said before, you can see how I'm kind of working back onto the nose as well, because once I found the fur was in around the nose area, the nose didn't stand out quite so much, so I decided to add a little bit more shadows to the nose. And just using sepia 10% and a little bit of anthraquinoid pink to do that. The anthraquinoid pink is quite a powerful colour, it's very opaque, so I try and use that with a very light hand and very sparingly. And here I am using the white, so again like we did with the cheek and the chin, I'm just adding little highlights on top of the areas we've created before. So with this part it's very small strokes, so I'm not sure if you can really see. Now you can kind of see that the strokes that I'm using are really small here because the fur on the nose is so short, and it's kind of a little bit spiky, so I tried to use as short a stroke as absolutely possible. And then just kind of shading the area around the nose with sepia 10%, and again adding highlights with the white. So it's okay to kind of do these in any order that you like. If you find that some areas need to be darkened as you're adding highlights, darken them up and then add the highlights again over the top. It really doesn't matter too much. I even like to add a few shadows after adding the highlights, just because I find sometimes they need to pop out a little bit more. So yeah, if you want your highlights to pop out, add more shadows. It's basically the theory of what goes up must come down. Every highlight and every shadow, or every highlight area is an area that is kind of up and raised, so the sun hits it. Every shadow is kind of down, away from the sun. So what comes up must go down, if that makes sense. And then again, using my favourite sepia 10%, just to add a little bit more detail there. And you can see me just adding a little bit more shadows to the outer corner of the nose. And then I did kind of larger strokes, just a few, with the white pencil again to blend the top of that nose together. So yeah, the white is a very good blending pencil, but it can be a little bit strong as well. So just be careful if you decide to use the white pencil to blend any colours together. And then when I did the shadows for the area on the nose, I used the French grey, and I used this with such a light hand. I find that most of the darker colours, once they're kind of paired on top of any other pencil, they become so dark. So I tried to use this with such a light hand, and yeah, it created a much softer effect. I've been saying use a light hand for quite a lot of this piece, but be especially careful when doing the shadows. And again, using my favourite colour there, just on the top of the nose to create a little bit of fur. And you can kind of see that diamond shape now in the middle of the nose. That's just where the two parts of the fur go together. And yet it creates this little gap in the fur. I'm not really sure what to call it, basically. And then using my Derwent pencil just to go over that little area there that I found dark. Derwent eraser, sorry. So I have a mono eraser and a Derwent electric eraser. And then again using the steel grey on this right side of the face just to shadow it up. The right side of the face was a lot lighter than the left side of the face, so I will show you a little bit about how I do this side. So because it was a little bit lighter, I tried to use the colours a little less, so a little less shadows, but most of the process was the same, so using the steel grey just on the whiskers, and as you can see there, I'm just starting to map out those lines. And yeah, I'm doing it in the direction of the fur, although it doesn't really matter too much at this stage because it will be wet down. It's just a good habit to get into. And then again with the sepia 10%. So again, most of the steps that we're going to do on the right side of the face are very similar to the ones that we did on the left side, but it is ever so slightly lighter, so that's why I'm going to show you anyway. I just added a tiny little dark spot on the tip of the nose with a sepia 10%. I just thought that it needed a little bit more of a shadow there. And again, like we did on the left side, just blending that with water. And this is a damp brush that I've just kind of wet and then taken off any excess water with my hand. I find that using a larger brush, so I think this is a size 6, I found that using a larger brush helps create a more smooth effect. So I used to use a lot of smaller brushes, but when I did a study on a horse bit, I found that one side was a lot smoother than the other, and that's because I used the large brush on one side and a smaller brush on the other. So I found that the smaller brush kind of pushed the colours around a little bit more, while the larger brush blended those colours together a little bit better. And it's not too large that it's kind of annoying or in the way or pushing colours around too much in areas I don't want. But it's large enough that they blend together really nicely, but I can also get really nice details with them. And then you can just see me checking to make sure that area is dry before adding my little steel grey pencil onto that area. Now these pencils are water soluble, so you can also wet the tip of the pencil and use that to paint with, or you can dip them in the water. You can get these pencils wet, I just prefer to mostly wait for the layers to dry, but that is a technique you can use. I tend to dip the white pencil into the water quite a bit myself for highlights on the eye as you've seen hopefully in the other video, and then I kind of just wait for that pencil to dry, and then once it's nice and dry I sharpen it again. It can be a little bit softer if you have the pencil still damp, but once it's nice and dry the pencil should go back to its kind of original state and you should be able to use it as you did before. And then just kind of around the nose I'm creating tiny little bits of fur, again doing that little winged eyeliner look on the nose with the sepia 10% pencil, and just using really short strokes now for where the fur connects to the nose. And then taking the sepia 50% just to darken up kind of the edge of the nose there. And you can kind of see how small those little tiny strokes were then, and that's sometimes how small you need to go. They're just really small little strokes. And I think I used the brown on the inner part of the nose just to add a little bit more shadow. And then you can kind of see now as I move further away from the nose, the strokes get a little bit bigger. So this will be one of the dry layers. As you can see, I'm doing a little bit more detail now. I'm using the sepia 10% and a mix of the steel grey. And just focusing on that little whisker line there. Again, I found when I push the highlights kind of down, and so when I say down, you want to start with a heavier pressure and then lighten it up as you get to the end of the pencil stroke. So it's kind of important to kind of vary your stroke as it goes. So the darker part of the stroke is heavier and then the lighter part is softer, if that makes sense. And the closer to the shadow you get, the heavier you want it to be. And then again, just kind of curving round the edge of the muzzle there with that pencil. And the same thing we did on the other side, just curving in the strokes towards the nose. So as you can see already, hopefully this area is a lot lighter than the left side, and we're really not going to add too many shadows to the right side because this area is definitely a lot more in the sunlight. So if you don't already know, this is my own reference photo. I took this photo outside. I think the day was a little bit overcast, so that's why the white wasn't super overexposed. If it's super sunny, then the white fur can kind of get overexposed, which means it's super bright white and you can't really see too much detail. Also, animals don't really like it when it's super bright sometimes, so they might squint their eyes a little bit. But this was a perfect day to photograph this cat, and she was really happy to just sit there for me. So I took the photo outside because I found that when I take it outside it's a lot more natural light. The colours that are reflecting off her fur are very natural. The lighting inside can sometimes be very artificial, and sometimes people have bulbs that are a little bit more yellowy, or they reflect off the wood of the walls, and that can also be a little bit more warm and yellowy. And if you want to go for that look, that's fine, but I prefer much more natural light to work from. So that's why I took the photo outside, and that's why the lighting kind of is a little bit brighter on just the right side of her face. And yeah, that's not really too important, but I guess if you want to take your own photos, kind of try and pay attention to the time of day and the lighting that you're using. I also like to kind of have the light or source kind of behind me, or at least to one side of me, rather than behind the subject itself, because obviously that can kind of block out the sun and then you don't see much detail on the face either. And then yeah, you can kind of just see when we get back on the cat that I'm just creating tiny little strokes with a steel grey, and then the CB 10% just blending the area near the nose to the cheek. So I think cats have they have both strong and subtle anatomy. So like the cheeks are obviously the muzzle is very prominent, but the cheekbones aren't as strong as say a horse or a dog, and that can be quite hard, especially like the eyebrow area, the top of the head completely, it's almost smooth, but there is detail there that is important to try and capture. So like the cheeks, for example, you can kind of see on her as you move up from the muzzle to the eye, it gets a little bit more shadowy, and that's just a little shape of the cheek that we need to capture in this work. And again, like I said before, just blending the white into the dark, and I just used the steel grey and the CP of 50% for this piece. Now because this is the right side, I'm not going to darken it up too much, so I don't think that I use any like French grey or slate grey, or maybe if I do I use a little tiny bit. But yeah, again, this area is supposed to be lighter than the left side, so I try and keep that nice and light. As you can see, layering the CP 10% over the steel grey works really nicely, and you're kind of getting clumps of fur a little bit more. And yeah, that's just softening up that side a lot nicer. So when doing kind of long-haired cats, it's important to kind of focus on where the hair breaks. So when you have a clump of hair where there's a gap in between the next clump of hair, and then where your clumps of hair sit, which direction they go in, and how they layer on top of each other. And here you can see I'm just using the slate grey ever so slightly, just on kind of the underside of this cat's cheek. And then again near the eye, but I remember on the right side of the eye it was quite a lot darker here. And then again near the nose. So yeah, I'm quite happy with how that looks. You can kind of see the difference already between the areas that I've worked on and the white of the paper. Although it is white, there's lots of colours that go into there, and yeah, they stand out against just the complete whiteness of the paper. I find that if you take a reference photo, especially a white animal, if you're struggling with it, if you have any photo editing software, if you just take that photo out and put it on a white background, so you cut the subject completely out of the background, put it on a white one instead, you can really see all the colours that go into that cat's fur. It can really help with tonal values if you're struggling. Similarly as well to the nose, when I add the black fur in, I do edit the white fur a little bit. Not so much with this piece, but sometimes I might find that I'm reworking areas on the white just because I want to darken them up a little bit more. The background and kind of the surroundings of the animal can definitely have an influence on the colours that you see, so it's kind of important to note that and try and pay attention if you can. So for example, when she was on like a green background, the colours looked very different to this white background. So it might help, depending on the kind of background that you choose to do, to make your reference photo fit that background, if that makes sense. So if you're working on brown paper, make your like around the subject brown. And then again, just lightening up the top part of the nose with this light flesh. I found that it was quite golden area compared to the rest of it, so yeah, I used that pencil there. Okay, so moving on to the chest area now. As you can see, I'm using my favourite pencil, the Sepia 10%, and as you can see I'm using really broad strokes now for this piece. I have mapped out kind of the clumps of the fur beforehand with, I think I used the Sepia 10% then, I can't remember. But yeah, I mapped out the clumps of fur already, and I'm kind of just doing very rough tonal values now. And again, like before, I like to use a nice mix of Sepia 10% with steel grey, and I used quite a lot of light flesh, especially under the chin. I found that when her chest fur was reflecting off her chin fur, it made a really nice kind of golden pinky colour. So I used a lot of light flesh 10% on that area, and this is the dark flesh as well. So those two colours together create kind of a nice goldeny colour. And then back again with the Sepia 10%. As I've said before, once the Sepia 10% is laid over kind of most of the pencils, it becomes a lot darker. So I had to be a little bit careful about making sure I didn't go too dark with that colour, but it worked really nicely, I think, in this area. Okay, so then once I've got the kind of rough colours down, I again blend it with water, and as you can see this is a lot more golden than the other areas we've done before. So as I've explained before, white and even black reflects the colours around it. So basically all that's happening here is the white from the chest is kind of reflecting the chin of her face. So that's why it's kind of a lot more golden and a little bit pinky. It's just a lot warmer underneath this part of her face. And you can see it kind of looks a little bit patchy, but that's okay because we will be going over it with more colours, and it is fur, so it's not completely smooth anyway, so it doesn't matter if it's a little bit rough or a little bit patchy. And then just repeating the same process again over the different clumps of fur. So I found it really kind of beneficial to break it down into these little clumps, because while I wait for one area to dry I could work on another one. Similar to how we did with the face, but this time just focusing on clumps of fur. So when I say clumps of fur, I'm talking about kind of sections of fur that have clumped together to create kind of a big fluffy part, if that makes sense. So instead of like individual pieces of fur, they kind of group together to make one big looking strand, if that makes any sense at all. So in kind of old animations, like Pixar animations, or even older from different brands, one thing that they kind of struggled with was creating fur to be believable, because they kind of had to animate every single strand, whereas fur, especially on cats like this, they do clump together. So more recently, like the Lion King, they've kind of created that group of fur rather than the individual strands. And that's basically what we have to do as artists here. We have to group this fur together so that it creates the illusion of a realistic looking cat. And again, kind of just repeating the process on the right side. Now this right side kind of under the chin was very dark, but the rest of the cat on the right side is very light. I tried to keep a lot of that area very clear, so a lot of the paper shows through on the right side of the cat rather than the left. Some animals, if you have seen my white dog for example, she was in very kind of contrasting light. So I think most of her left side was actually, there was no white paper showing through at all, because she had such contrasting lighting on her fur. Whereas this cat, I think because it's a lot longer as well, it absorbs more light, so a lot of the white paper does show through. And here you can kind of just see I'm mapping out again areas of shadows. So you can see I'm kind of just mapping out areas on the clumps, but I'm not really focusing on any details. It's literally just colour and shadows. All of the details are done over the top, and if I did any details now, they'd be blended out. So yeah, I'm just doing the basic shadows. If you kind of squint your eyes, or if you have a photo editing software again, you could kind of turn this photo into a blurry photo, and it might help you see those shadows. And again, taking the light flash just to make it nice and golden. So yeah, like I said, I have broken these up into sections of kind of clumps of fur, but they are kind of all blending together as one big one at the moment, just because there's really not that much detail there. It's just shadows and colours, and yeah, it's really kind of blocks of colours at the moment. So that's okay if that happens. I will add detail over the top, and then yeah, I can kind of define certain areas. So when I did the clumps of fur, I tried to kind of think about how they layered together. So for example, this area that I'm working on at the moment is actually the top layer of fur, and then everything else kind of fits underneath it. So the further back you go and the lower down you go in this kind of ranking of fur layers, the darker they'll usually be, because the further back from the sun they are. So I hope that makes sense, and that is something to consider when you're kind of layering up these fur layers. So here you can kind of see I'm working on the layer underneath this top one that I've just mapped out of colour. And I'm just using the sepia 10% to add little bits of shadows and just bringing out those, yeah, kind of gaps and breaks in the fur. So basically all that's happening here is I'm drawing the area of fur that's underneath this clump and any kind of shadowy areas that might happen in the break of fur. And it's just very rough. There's not really any individual hairs going on here, although I am using kind of pencil strokes in the direction of the fur. I'm not actually trying to detail any area out. I'm just creating that very rough shape of the fur clumps. And you can see me just adding little flicks of hair and then creating the shadows with this pencil. Again, just paying really close attention to my reference photo. The link for the reference photo is down in the description, or you can also find it on my Facebook page. I made a post about this piece when it first went live, so you can find the reference photo on my Facebook page. And you can see there how there's kind of a really big break in the fur, so not only is there a break, but then there's the shadow coming off the layers of fur above that one. So when it comes to kind of any drawing that you draw, you really just got to kind of draw what you see. So when I'm doing these clumps of fur, I just draw what I see. It's really easy to get into the habit of, oh well, I know how fur falls, so I'm going to draw it that way. But it's important to still pay attention to that reference photo, because I know my mind isn't always very correct, and if I tried to draw this cat without a reference photo, it wouldn't work quite as well. Drawing what you know can be really helpful if you have a blurry reference photo, for example, but if you have a nice clear one, use it, draw what you see, try not to assume anything. I always like look at my reference photo and then draw and then look back, and it's literally that quick. I do it every probably 10 seconds at the most. I try to spend more time looking at my reference photo than I do my own drawing. And you can just see I'm kind of adding the basics, like the outline of another clump of fur there, and then just softening it up toward the end. And you can see already how that side of the fur is starting to take shape. We've just got little lines now, we've got little breaks, we're getting more shadows. It's starting to come together and it's starting to look like really nice long white cat fur. Obviously we've got quite a long way to go from the finished product, but the basics are there and it's starting to get there. I'm not sure if there's any medium that doesn't take more than one layer. There might be, but it's kind of a slow process, unfortunately. You have to build up a lot of patience to draw. So again, just being really soft with the steel grey, going over other areas that I've done before. I find that steel grey and CP 10%, as I've said before, can kind of darken each other up, but steel grey on its own is a very cool toned colour, and sepia 10% is a very warm toned colour, so if I find the area is getting a bit too warm, then I'll cool it down with a steel tone grey. For example, this area here, I found it had a bit too much colour in it, so I toned it down a little bit with the steel grey. And I'm just using the sepia 50% just to add a little bit more shadow to this side. And you can see I'm kind of mapping out that cheek as well. And this is where you can kind of start to define the cheek from the chest. So I'm pushing those shadows, as you can see, into the muzzle on the mouth. So I'm pushing those areas into the whisker because they will become darker, and then taking them back out again down the fur of the cat. So there shouldn't be any harsh line because I'm pushing the colour into the face and out onto the chest. So it should be a really nice soft transition between the two. So as you can see, just blending that line out so it's not such a harsh contrast between the shadows and the lighter areas. So as you can see, even though we've only kind of used creamy colours like dark flesh and light flesh, it does really kind of look quite pinky toned in my opinion, and that's just through layering lots of different colours together, and then again using the French grey and the slate grey and just pulling out any darker highlights that I want to accentuate, I guess. It's important, I find, to vary the colours that I use quite a bit, so I don't want to always use just the French grey or always just the slate grey. If I vary them out, it creates kind of a different levels of darkness, if that makes sense. And then again, just using the steel grey to pull out that clump of fur. And then very lightly with the French grey, just adding a little bit detail to the clump there. And you can see I'm using really nice big strokes, sorry. Keeping them short when I need to, but most of the time they're really nice and long, sketchy pencil strokes. I find that kind of less is more with white fur, especially long white fur. Just doing a few, like I did with the French grey, just doing a few strokes, pencil strokes in the fur to break up the clumps helps create the illusion of the fur, rather than focusing on, okay, I need to do this many individual hairs in this clump. I find just doing a few, it really does help create that illusion. You don't need to go kind of overboard with it, especially white fur. I find white fur is such a difficult one to detail. And again, just taking this no, it was a dark flesh 10%, 50%, oh my goodness, dark flesh 50% there, just to kind of create a more golden colour. And then adding the sepia 10% over the top. I like the sepia 10% for a lot of reasons. I've talked about it a lot through this video, but it's also a good guide tool as well as a shading tool. So I use it to kind of guide where I want to put the detailed clumps in, and then when I've got a good line where I want the clumps, I'll shade them out and blend them out and create the illusion of fur. So you can see I'm kind of just marking off where I want the clump to be, and then once I'm happy with it, I blend the area in. So you can see now there's lots of different breaks in the fur, and that's just really creating the illusion of layers. So again, you can see me taking the French grey and just kind of darkening up the area where the clump is. So I kind of tried to start from the area closest to the top layer of the clump and then fade it out as I get towards the end of it. And then again using the French grey just to add a little bit of detail, so just adding some nice wispy hairs in there. And again, this is kind of the final layer, so there's not really going to be too much going on top of this layer. This is the end product, if you like. So I don't think I really spoke about this too much before, but I like to use these pencils because I find that they fill the gap in any tooth of the paper. So you don't really need to take too many layers to fill in the gap of the tooth. Once you've wet the colours, they kind of blend together and it fills in a lot of the tooth of the paper. So you don't have too much white showing through. Obviously on this cat there's quite a lot of white showing through, but most of the time on like brown horses, for example, the paper is completely covered by the colour of the pencil. And then once that wet layer is dry, I like to add dry pencil on top, and it kind of just brings out the pigment of the colours even in the dry pencil. Because I've created a wet base, it creates a nice a nice base underneath, and it brings out the colour of the dry pencil. So again, just taking the nice French grey and just popping out some of those shadowy areas, this time kind of underneath the chin and the cheek. So when I get kind of closer to the cat's head, so like the chin is closer to the chest area, I try and darken that area up a little bit more. And then when kind of two clumps of fur meet together, I try and darken the closest parts to each other up again, if that makes any sense. So where the two touch should be kind of the darkest area, and then as you get further out towards the end of the clump, that should be the lightest area. As you can see, this looks very, very dark at the moment, but that's okay because it is the area closest to the cat, and it is very heavily under shadow at the moment, so don't worry if it looks too dark. Once you've got the rest of the cat in, once you get the rest of the white fur in, it will start to make sense. And again, kind of just repeating the process that we did on the left side, creating a really rough, shadowy area, not focusing too much on the detail at this stage. And I used the steel grey there, sorry, just to create again a different depth of fur texture on the area. So that was a little bit of a clump there, as you can see, and by using the steel grey it just kind of made that area a little bit different to the rest, where I've mostly used sepia. And again, just mapping out the clumps so you can see how they're all kind of going in different directions. So the one that I'm working on at the moment is kind of going towards the right, and the ones on the other side are kind of going to the left. So yeah, hopefully you can see how they're starting to curl in towards the right side, whereas the other ones are going towards the left. Again, this is where I was paying attention to the reference photo and I could see where the different directions of the clumps are going. Because it's a cat fur and it's not very precise, it's not like a feature, for example, it moves quite often. You don't need to be perfectly exact with this, so don't worry if like a tiny little hair strand isn't exactly where it is in the reference photo, but do try and get it as close as possible if you can. Again, don't stress yourself out over it though. I don't want anyone to be like super upset if it's not exactly like the reference photo. The most important part is the features of the face. And here you can see I'm kind of doing these tiny little clumps that were a bit more prominent than the others. Some areas of clumps you find might be a little bit softer than others. These had quite a few breaks in the fur, so I tried to map those out with the sepia. And again, just adding another little break in the fur then, that you could see how I was kind of darkening the area closest to the rest of the fur and then fading it out as I got further out. And then I used the steel grey just to add another few little curls, again because these were kind of a different colour to the rest of them. I decided to use the steel grey just to add a little bit of depth there. I did go over it with the sepia 10% because I thought the steel grey on its own was a bit too blue, so I tried to warm that up a little bit with the sepia 10%. And then again, taking the dark flesh just to go underneath the chin area on top of the chest there, just to kind of add a little bit more pigment, a little bit more gold and fleshy colour to it. And then again, taking the French grey just to add a little bit more shadows to that area. Like I said before, the area under the chin should really be the darkest because that's under the most shadow. And hopefully you can as well see how some of the clumps of fur are overlapping, because it isn't a 2D creature, it is very 3D and fur has lots of layers to it. So like I said before, there are top layers and bottom layers, and sometimes they do interlock and weave and yeah, kind of fall on top of one another. So that's what's happening there with a couple of those kills. Some of those kills are actually on top of the other ones that we've already drawn. And it's just little details like that that will really add to the realism of a piece. And I must say, when I'm kind of creating a lot of my pieces, it's kind of trial and error, hope and pray. I just draw what I see and hope that it works out okay, and if I'm not completely happy with it, then I'll try something else. So like for example, when I added the little grey fur clump using the steel grey, I wasn't completely happy with it, so I decided to try something else and added the sepia 10% on top. I do always try and strive for something that I'm happy with, so if I'm not happy with it, I'll try and change it rather than scrapping the whole piece. Sometimes I have restarted pieces, but I'd rather try and fix the problem with a solution if possible. So yeah, I don't want to sound like I completely know what I'm doing, because I have to admit I'm mostly just feel like I'm making it up on the spot as I go, but it's just honestly through knowledge of tonal values, colour and anatomy. And here I'm just prepping my Tombow mono eraser. So this is a little eraser, it's got a very tiny little point on it, hopefully that you can see. It's flat, but the eraser is a round shape, and it's just a basic, it's just in a rubber really, and it lifts the pigment off in a really nice soft way. I find that this is the best solution for this paper because it's quite a soft paper, so the rubber doesn't damage it, or it doesn't damage the paper, but it lifts enough pigment off that I'm happy with. So I'm just using this to create a couple little highlights. I tried to use this kind of in conjunction with the white pencil because I find that obviously it's a lot easier to lay a pencil on top of paper rather than it is to lay a pencil on top of more pencil. So just by pulling up a little bit of pigment, I can easily highlight over the top. And the Tombow mono eraser I find is a really nice soft kind of pigment remover. There are other methods out there that you can use to remove the pigment, but this is just what I found works best for this type of paper. I will hopefully make a video on other types of pigment remover in the future though. And then again, like I said before, just taking the white pencil and going over those areas. And this is where you can kind of add a little bit more individual strands, because this is the very top layer, so this is where you kind of just want to draw the individual strands of fur. At this point I'm trying not to create clumps, I'm trying to do the strands as I see them. So you can see like I'm trying to draw where other areas might overlap certain areas, and yeah, just popping out some highlights there. I try to also draw over any clumps of shadows because I find that fur, it won't necessarily ignore the shadowy areas, so fur does fall over shadows, if that makes sense. So yeah, just draw little strands of fur over little shadowy clumps that you've made as well. And again, doing the same thing on the right side there, just adding little tiny highlights and drawing over the clumpy fur areas. And then here I just added kind of the fluffy parts of the chin that I talked about before, because it's a lot easier to draw them now that the shadows are in. So I'm just adding those little details with this white pencil, just those little long strands of fluff that you might see coming out of the chin. So anytime that I do take a little bit of a pause, you might see me like pull my hand away from the paper and like twirl the pencil a little bit. That's just me kind of taking a step back from the piece and looking at it and thinking, am I happy with this? And I actually wasn't super happy at this point, so I decided to add a little bit of the slate grey just to darken up under the chin. I don't want to say I'm not super happy with it, like, oh, I hate it. I just noticed that some areas like the chin could be darker, so I darkened that up with a slate grey, and then the top of the chest as well. Yeah, this isn't me hating the piece or anything like that, it's just looking at areas that can be improved upon, and that's just basically a little bit of self-critique that you need to do when you're drawing. Just take a little bit of a pause, look at the piece, and look at your reference photo, and then make it any changes that you might think are necessary. So here you go again, you can see I'm blending certain areas out with the sepia 10%, and then adding some highlights to this white fur with the white pencil. And you can just see how beautifully it just layers over all of those layers of pencil that we've already done. And then here I am just working on the right side of the cheek, so I'm just creating again more little clumps of fur and lining out where kind of the face ends. So on fluffy cats especially, you can kind of see how the chest and the face might sort of blend together, the chest and the neck even, because she's so fluffy, but there is a slight little line there, so that's all I'm doing here, is just trying to make the difference between the neck and the chest and the face a little bit more defined. So I'm just adding a little bit of shadows and guidelines with my sepia pencil. I did notice there was kind of quite a harsh clump of fur here, right there, I'm not sure if you saw it, where the fur kind of did show the gap between the neck and the head. And I'll define it a little bit more as we carry on, but I noticed that in the reference photo, so I decided to, try and add that in. It's starting to come together a little bit more now. You can see the difference between the head and the neck. And again, just adding a little bit more sepia, and here and there I was just adding kind of a bit more of a blend between the muzzle and the face. So that was just pushing the pigment from the neck into the face. And here I'm just defining the little edges where the black fur will go. And again, just adding some more little clumps, darkening up that shadow. And I don't do too much with the slate grey because it is quite a cool tone grey. So then I bring in the sepia 50%. And the sepia 50% you can't really see too well on the camera, but it's more of a kind of pinky, orangey grey rather than the French grey, which is more brown toned. So as you can see on the left, I have my colour chart. I do think you should make one of these if you can. They are so helpful. I always hated them. I hate making them. But oh my goodness, it's so helpful for this type of pencil especially. And hopefully you can see how that face is starting to come out and be a little bit more defined next to the neck. And then working on that line there with the sepia 50%. And then adding some little highlights with a white pencil. You can see how I'm just pausing to make sure I'm putting them in the right area, just studying my reference photo and studying my drawing. And then adding a little pencil to the cheeks. When you work white into the dark areas, you have to be careful because the white pencil can sometimes pick up a little bit of the dark pigment. So I tend to twirl my pencil a lot, so I'm working on a new area of the end of the pencil and then kind of brush it off on some sandpaper to make sure there's no pigment left on the end of my white pencil. So here I'm kind of just blotting out the very bottom layer of the white chest. So I thought it was easier to work from the bottom up with this part because obviously that's kind of the bottom layer. Everything else is going on top of it, so any wispy hairs are going to go on top of those shadows. So I thought it was a little bit easier to do that first. But as you can see, I'm just kind of jotting in very rough shadows at this point. Now I'm not going to go into too much the right side of this cat, I'm mostly going to focus on the left side, just because the process is very similar and this video is very long already, so I don't want to repeat too many of the same steps. I feel like I already might have done that, but I hope you found it useful so far. Anyway, we're adding the sepia 10% and the French grey again, just to create that rough base shadow of clumps. The bottom left corner, as you see here, is a lot more shadowed, so I'm adding a lot more pressure, a lot more pigment. Yeah, I'm really trying to make that area as dark as I can at this point, and then blending it out with water. If you're unhappy with how an area has blended and you think it could be a little bit softer, feel free to use some water to blend that out. I like to keep all of the layers on top nice and dry though, to protect the pencil and to add more detail as well. I find that it's a lot easier to add detail with a dry pencil than the wet pencil. So now that's all nice and dry. There was a little bit of a cut there that you didn't see, but that is nice and dry paper now. And then I'm just adding some colour on top of this. So this is just a sepia 10% on top of those areas that we've already done. So again, like I did before, just mapping out any little clumps of hair here, and at the same time adding shadows. So I noticed there was kind of another layer of fur, and I tried to add that on this bit here. So again, as I did with the cheek, I pushed the pigment up and down just to create a kind of a wave of fur. So when you're doing kind of harsh clumps, you want to push pigment down from the top layer, and when you want to do kind of waves of clump, you want to push pigment up and down. So the most dark part of a wave should be the middle, and the most dark part of a clump should be the top, hidden underneath another clump of fur, or a feature of a face, for example. So as you can see there's just kind of a little bit of a wave now because the pigment is going up towards the other clump and then back down. So when you're doing white fur, you don't really have to do too many layers because it is so light. I find that the sepia 10% is a good colour. So I've only done one wet layer, and then I'm using the sepia 10% to kind of add those little clumps, and I'm not going to darken it too much from this. Okay, so when I'm doing the clumps, I try to pay attention to my reference photo, as I've said before, and just draw what I see. It doesn't matter if it's perfect, because again, fur never falls in the same place all the time exactly perfect, so I try not to worry about it too much, but kind of get just a general gist of how it falls and how it works by looking at the reference photo. And again, just trying to keep it really nice and soft, so using really nice soft pencil strokes. And using really nice long ones as I get towards the end of the chest. So her fur was very layered because of the way she sat. It kind of stuck up towards the top of her chest, and then as you got further down her chest, it curved round and was a lot longer. So that's basically why it's so kind of clumpy and short on top, whereas on the bottom it's a lot kind of longer and smoother and big strokes. And then as I get further down, the bottom left corner is kind of a lot closer to where her shoulder is, where her leg is. It's not quite there, but it's close. So that bit of fur towards the bottom left corner is a lot darker. And as you can see, I'm just adding a little bit of water here. I wasn't super happy with how some of those areas were blending out, so I just decided to use a little bit of water to soften those edges. And the detail is honestly so different on the recording compared to in person. It doesn't look that much different, but there was quite a big difference between the two, so I was a lot happier when I blended them out. And then again, wait for it to dry, and then add pencil over the top. So I'm just kind of adding a little bit more shadow to some of the clumps. Again, focusing a little bit more heavily on like areas right underneath the clump, and then softening it out towards the end. And yeah, as you can see again, using this as a colour, it just adds another layer of depth that there wasn't already there. And again, not focusing too heavily on individual strands at this point, but just drawing in the direction of the fur. So by shading in the direction of the fur, it does create the illusion of hair, even though I'm not actually drawing any individual strands. And here you can kind of see I'm pushing the pigment up just because I want to soften the edges of those clumps. And you can see already how that steel grey has made such a difference to the sepia areas that we've done before, and that's just by adding a little bit more steel grey. So one thing I did notice as well was how some of the ends of the clumps were a lot softer than others, and some had more breaks, so there I'm just breaking up a little bit of the fur and softening out the edges. Some clumps were a lot harsher than others, for example like the top layer, whereas others did have a bit more of an end to them and blended into the others a little bit more. So for that I just kind of used more sepia and yeah, just softened those edges as they faded into each other. And here you can see I'm kind of defining those clumps a little bit more. It works a lot better now that it's on kind of a wet layer underneath that's now dry, but was a wet layer. And yeah, the sepia just layers a lot better on top of that, and it creates a beautiful way to add detail. And here again, I'm just using my mono eraser to soften up these little areas and add highlights. I did find that this paper wasn't particularly the best for lifting pigment off of, but it did layer beautifully and it was really nice and smooth. So I ended up preferring the white pencil to the mono eraser in this occasion, but the mono eraser was still a really nice addition to help highlight this white fur. And then I just use a big makeup brush to brush off any excess pigment or any excess like rubber bits and yeah, that'll keep the paper nice and clean. And as you can see, hopefully I've taped the paper down, and that's just using masking tape. I have explained most of how to start this piece in the first part of the video, how to draw the cat. So if you want to see how I kind of prep the paper, please go and watch that video. And yeah, next week's part will all be about the black fur. We'll also talk about the ears and the whiskers. So yeah, there's a lot of parts to next week's video. It's not just all about black fur. And again, just taking a little bit of light flesh, and I took this colour into the shadow area, specifically the shadows, for the similar reason as we did so on the chest underneath the chin. I found that the light flesh made a gold colour which reflected really nicely, as the shadows in the clumps were a lot warmer. And here I'm also taking the umber very, very lightly because this is quite a strong colour, and just kind of adding a little bit more depth to those shadows as well. And then the sepia on top, and you can see how already, just by adding those few colours underneath it, it's popped out that pigment a little bit more. And then just adding some white highlights on top with the white pencil. This was mostly just for the little wispy hairs, as I did leave a lot of the negative space in the paper free to create the highlights instead. So I'm just using the white pencil mostly for little wispy hairs, and those are hairs that might end up kind of straying from the clumps and going over other areas. And then taking the French grey and just darkening up a few little clumps. So again, just taking the French grey to concentrate on the areas in the shadows, and also for a few little wispy hairs in the fur. And again, really, really light pressure with this French grey because I found it was quite an overpowering colour if I put too much pressure on it, especially over the layered pencils that we already had. So yeah, I just kept that pressure really, really nice and light. And it added for really nice soft little wispy shadowy hairs. I would recommend having kind of one colour for wispy highlights and one colour for wispy shadow hairs. So mine were white and French grey. Now, although the whiskers were kind of coming out of the muzzle into the chest area, I decided to leave those until last when I was doing the black fur as well, just because I thought it would kind of pull the piece all together. You can do the white hairs now if you want to, or the whiskers now if you want to, but I prefer to leave them to the very last stage. Again, just highlighting some of those clumps. It is, like I've said before, quite a slow process, a lot of rinse and repeat and layers, but that's just how you build up the depth of the fur. It's quite a slow process. And now here I'm just kind of focusing on the darker part of the cat. So this is the darker area where kind of it's closer to the shoulder and it's a lot darker. Yeah, it's just a lot darker. So this is kind of one of the darker waves. And then again I push the pigment up and then I pull it down. So there shouldn't be a harsh line, but the darkest part should be the middle of the wave. And then this bit kind of had a bit more of a layer to it, so there was like a clump that was lifted off a little bit of the dark area. So I'm just pushing the pigment up to soften the edges. But there should be a little bit more of a harsher edge on this area here. And then just taking the sepia again, just blending those areas out and filling in the clumps. And as you can see, I'm just kind of really defining those clumps. I found that these groups of clumps were a lot more defined and a lot harsher than the other ones. And then just completely covering that area because this area was a lot darker than the rest of the rest of the chest. And then again adding steel grey over the top of the sepia. So you can see already how the left corner is a lot darker than the rest, and that's because we completely filled the area with both sepia 10% and the steel grey. And then I'm just adding a little bit of sepia 50%, just to add a little bit more definition to those clumps, so we're doing a little bit more kind of individual hairs now. Again, only slight, not going too overboard. I found one mistake that I used to make when doing a lot of animals was I would kind of take all of the colours that I used, so for example let's go with 3 colours, sepia 10%, steel grey and sepia 50%, and I would kind of use those 3 and those 3 only all over the piece. There was no kind of variation there. I only used those and those were my 3 kind of shadows, if that makes sense. So to vary that up, I added more colours, and instead of using sepia 50%, I would use a different one. In some areas, I wouldn't go that dark at all, I'd just use sepia 10%, for example. So you really want to create kind of different ranges of depth and darkness. You don't want to use the same colours all over the whole thing, apart from like steel grey and sepia 10%, because those are good base colours, and when you layer them with others, they can look very different. But for shadows, for example, it's important to vary that up. And I'm just using a couple of dark colours here just to add a little bit more detail under the wispy hairs. Again, paying attention to the layers. There are things going underneath, things happening underneath these clumps that you can't really see, but there are layers there. So try and create that illusion as well. And then using a bit of burnt sienna there just to kind of warm up that corner. You can see I'm just trying to blend that corner out again a little bit more. Trying to change the direction of the fur ever so slightly as well as I can. And as you can see again, just going in the direction of the fur, and that really helps create the illusion. And then again, I took the steel grey and I did it in quite a large area this time, just because I felt like this area needed to be a little bit more shadowy. So I took the steel grey and I kind of covered most of the area here, as you can see. I did it with quite a light pressure, so I didn't completely cover any details that I'd already made. It wasn't going to blend them in completely, but just enough that it was created a nice soft effect, but also a nice shadow over the whole area. And then again, I think I took the sepia temp 50% and just kind of created a little bit more shadow in this left corner. You can see how I'm kind of curling up some bits of fluff and taking some areas down. And then again with the white, just going over the top to create those nice wispy little hairs. If you don't want to change your whole pencil brand, but you would like to try a pencil from Caran D'Ache, I would completely recommend this white pencil. If you're looking for a white pencil, please try the white Caran D'Ache Museum Aquarelle. It's so nice. Yeah, it just layers beautifully over everything. So yeah, that's it for this piece. I think mostly, I'm not going to show you the right side just because, yeah, it's almost exactly the same as the left. I used maybe a little bit less darker colours just because it was more in the light, but that is mostly it for this video. I hope you like it. I hope you found it useful. Please let me know. And if you do follow this tutorial, please also tag me in on social media. I would really love to see what you create. If you have any questions, yeah, please let me know. If you're still confused, drop me a message, drop me a comment. Honestly, yeah, just ask and I'll try and help as best as I possibly can. I'll try and list all of the materials down in the description below, as well as a link to the reference photo, which you can also find on my Facebook page. So yeah, I hope you found this video useful. Thank you so much for watching, and well done if you've made it this far. Yeah, thank you, and goodbye.